He insulted everyone, presidents, legends, even his closest friends. But there was one man, Don Rickles, never truly touched with his jokes. Not because he was afraid, but because the friendship meant too much. Frank Sinatra. They were the most unlikely pair in Hollywood. One was feared, the other laughed at. But behind the scenes, something rare was happening. Sinatra gave Rickles protection, power, and something even harder to come by in show business, real friendship. And for decades, Don returned the favor the only way he knew how, with loyalty disguised as laughter. But near the end, something changed. Rickles stopped deflecting with jokes. He started remembering out loud. And just before he died, at the age of 90, he finally admitted what Frank really meant to him. Not to get a laugh, but because he never got to say it when it mattered. What he finally revealed left fans in tears. It happened in a small club in the late 1950s. Don Rickles was still unknown, grinding through late sets and trying to survive on sharp wit and louder nerves. He had no manager, no fame, and no guarantee the next show would be any better than the last. He was just hoping the right person would walk in one night and see something worth saving. That night, someone did. Frank Sinatra entered the room. To the rest of the crowd, Sinatra's presence changed the air. He wasn't just a singer, he was power in a pressed suit. Club managers flinched, waiters straightened up. No one dared look him in the eye for too long. Rickles saw him, paused, and did something most comics wouldn't dream of. He told Sinatra to keep it down. He joked that Frank was ruining his set. He called him a loudmouth. No one laughed. The room froze, unsure if this kid had just ended his own career, and then Sinatra laughed. That moment didn't just break the silence, it rewrote the rest of Don Rickles' life. From that night forward, things started shifting. Sinatra remembered him. He started bringing Rickles around, gave him an introduction here, a quiet endorsement there. Suddenly, Rickles was being invited to dinners, bumped up on bills, and included in circles that didn't usually welcome comics, especially not ones who insulted celebrities for a living. But it wasn't just networking. Something real passed between them that night. Sinatra didn't just laugh at the joke, he saw something in Don, something worth encouraging, even protecting. Rickles never had to ask for favors. Frank gave them freely, not as charity, but as investment. Rickles' act was bold, bordering on reckless. He insulted people to their faces, and did it with such speed and confidence that audiences sometimes didn't know whether to laugh or flinch. One wrong crowd, one misjudged target, and the whole thing could collapse. But after that laugh from Sinatra, Rickles moved differently. He had permission now. Permission to keep doing what made him different. And more importantly, he had backup. Club owners who might have dropped him before suddenly couldn't afford to. Studio heads who found him too risky were now asking about him. The industry changed its tone because one man had decided Don Rickles mattered. And when Frank Sinatra made that kind of decision, no one argued. Rickles always pointed to that night as the break that saved him. What he didn't always say, at least not back then, was why it had mattered so much. His father had passed not long before. His confidence was fraying. The grind of show business had worn him down. He wasn't sure how much more fight he had left. That laugh wasn't just a career boost, it was a lifeline. In the years that followed, Rickles would build a name for himself as the man who said what others were afraid to. But no matter how high he climbed, he never forgot where the ladder had started. Sinatra didn't just open doors. He gave Rickles the kind of affirmation that couldn't be bought or manufactured. He made him feel like he belonged. And for a comic who had spent years wondering if there was even a place for someone like him in show business, that meant more than anything. Because in that moment, Frank didn't just laugh. He reached across the room and gave Rickles a future. Sinatra's support didn't end with introductions. It deepened over time and grew into something far more personal. It wasn't about appearances or publicity. Frank didn't promote Don Rickles because it made him look generous. He did it because he genuinely respected him, and because Rickles offered something few others ever gave Frank Sinatra authenticity. When Rickles got pulled from a show for crossing a line, it was often Sinatra who made the call that put him back on the schedule. Club owners who worried Don was too risky learned quickly that letting him go came with consequences. If Rickles was removed from a lineup, Sinatra might cancel his own appearance. Or worse, he'd never return to the venue. Word spread fast, and Rickles' name suddenly carried weight, not because he asked for it, but because Frank insisted on it. That kind of loyalty came at a time when Rickles needed it most. He wasn't a conventional comic. His humor was built on speed, tension, and fearlessness. He insulted the rich and powerful to their faces, relying on instinct and rhythm to keep from going too far. Sometimes he misjudged the moment. Sometimes he didn't. But either way, he knew he was playing with fire every night. And Sinatra stood behind him anyway. It wasn't just about shielding Don from fallout. Frank also gave him something more subtle. He gave him belonging. In a world of stars and sharks, Sinatra carved out space for Rickles at the table, not as a novelty, but as one of them. He brought him to dinners with the Rat Pack, introduced him to people who normally ignored comedians, and treated him as an equal. Rickles understood what that meant. Everyone around Frank wanted something. There were always favors, expectations, quiet debts being collected. But Don never asked for anything. He didn't need Sinatra's money or his influence. He only needed the room to be himself, and Frank gave it to him. That balance created a trust neither of them ever broke. Don never embarrassed Frank in public, never made the wrong kind of joke at the wrong time. He could push limits, but he always knew where the edge was, especially with Sinatra. There were times when Rickles teased Frank about the rumors, his temper, his connections, but he never crossed the line into disrespect. He knew better. Not because he feared what Frank might do, but because he valued the friendship too much to damage it. And what Rickles gave back was rare. He gave Frank space to laugh without needing to perform. Around everyone else, Sinatra had to maintain control. He had to be charming, composed, untouchable. But with Don, he could drop the act. Rickles was one of the few people who treated him like a man, not a myth. That kind of honesty was precious to Frank, even if he never said it aloud. Rickles offered something even more valuable than laughter. He offered safety. Not physical safety, but emotional safety. Frank could show up, sit in the audience, and know he would be roasted, but never betrayed. He could let his guard down because Rickles never weaponized the trust. The friendship wasn't part of the act, it was the reason the act worked. As the years went on, that bond only grew stronger. They called each other frequently. They showed up at each other's events, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. When Frank needed quiet support, Rickles was there. When Don felt out of place in elite circles, Frank made sure he was treated like family. They never talked about it in public. There were no grand declarations or sentimental speeches, but anyone who spent time around them knew this wasn't just friendship. It was loyalty, earned and honored over decades without ever needing to be explained. For decades, Don Rickles kept the deeper meaning of that friendship to himself. He joked about Sinatra often, but always with a safe distance. When asked what Frank meant to him, he deflected. He'd make a fast remark, roll his eyes, and pivot to a laugh. Sentiment wasn't part of his routine. He told stories, not feelings. It was his way of staying in control, of keeping the softer truths where no one could reach them. But time has a way of loosening those walls. And as Rickles aged, the sharpness began to give way to reflection. After Sinatra's death in 1998, something in Don shifted. He became quieter in interviews, less guarded. He didn't stop joking, but the edges weren't as sharp. The act was still there, but the man behind it started showing through. And when Sinatra's name came up, Rickles didn't change the subject anymore. He paused, sometimes for just a beat, sometimes for much longer. One day, Rickles shared something that no one had heard before. He spoke about how Sinatra helped him through his mother's passing, how Frank didn't send flowers or make a big gesture. He simply showed up, unannounced, sat beside him, and said nothing. Just being there was enough. Rickles said it meant more than any tribute or check could have. In another rare moment, he spoke about a night when he was hospitalized with an infection. He didn't want visitors, didn't want to be seen looking weak. But Sinatra came anyway. He sat with Don, told a few quiet stories, and left without saying goodbye. Rickles never forgot that. It wasn't the visit itself, it was that Frank never asked if he could come. He just came. But the moment fans remember most came in Rickles' final years, when the act slowed down and the spotlight grew softer. He admitted, with no punchline attached, that Sinatra had been the closest thing he ever had to a brother. He said they fought sometimes. They were both proud, both opinionated, both stubborn. But through every season of his life, Don said, Frank was constant. And then, quietly, he said something he had never shared before. He never got to say goodbye. When Sinatra died, Rickles was too shaken to speak. He didn't attend any public memorials. He refused interviews. People thought it was unusual, maybe even cold. But in truth, he was grieving in a way he didn't know how to express. The man who had given him so much was gone. And Rickles, for all his quick wit and cutting humor, didn't have the words for that kind of loss. Later, when he finally found the strength to speak about it, he admitted that he had rehearsed a goodbye in his head hundreds of times. He thought about calling Frank in those final days, thought about writing something, thought about showing up unannounced like Frank once had. But he never did. The moment passed, and then it was too late. Rickles said that regret stayed with him longer than any career disappointment ever had. He said it quietly, almost under his breath, and then moved on to another topic. But in that moment, something was clear. The jokes, the stories, the showmanship, they had all been ways of protecting something deeper. And for the first time, Don Rickles let that truth surface. He didn't say it for applause. He said it because it was the one thing he had never managed to do. He had made millions of people laugh, but he had never told Frank Sinatra what he really meant to him. And now, all he could do was hope Frank had already known. After Sinatra's death in May of 1998, Don Rickles didn't release a statement. He didn't speak to the press, didn't appear on any tributes, didn't even attend the larger public memorials held in Frank's honor. For a man who built his life in front of an audience, his silence was striking. Some mistook it for distance. Others assumed the friendship had faded with time. But those closest to Rickles knew the truth. He wasn't avoiding the attention. He was in mourning. For all his sharp edges, Rickles had always kept his real emotions out of the spotlight. When something cut him deeply, he hid it behind performance. With Sinatra gone, there was no more act to hide behind. The man who had stood beside him from the beginning, the one who had laughed first, vouched loudest, and stayed longest, was suddenly not there. And Rickles, who had never needed permission to speak, suddenly couldn't find the words. Years passed before he allowed himself to talk about it. And even then, he didn't do it on stage. It was in quieter moments, often when he wasn't being recorded, when he finally let the weight show. He said losing Frank was like losing a limb. Not a day passed where he didn't think of something he wanted to tell him. A joke, a memory, a story from the road, something that would have made Frank smile. Rickles never blamed himself for not saying goodbye, but the regret lingered. He admitted once, in a moment of unscripted honesty, that he always assumed he'd have more time, that Sinatra would call, that there would be one more dinner, one more chance to say what had never been said. But that call never came, and when the news broke, it left Rickles hollow. What made the grief harder was that no one else could understand what they had shared. Not fully. Rickles had other friends, other peers, but none who had stood beside him the way Sinatra had. It hadn't been a transactional relationship. It wasn't based on mutual benefit or shared stages. It was quieter than that, more personal. Theirs was a bond built on moments people didn't see, on quiet support, private laughter, and a loyalty that didn't need to be spoken aloud. In one of his final interviews, Rickles was asked which performer he missed the most. He hesitated, smiled, and finally said, "Frank." Then he moved on, as if the answer had explained itself. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. That was the thing about their friendship. It wasn't for show. It didn't need declarations or photo ops. It had survived decades, scandals, careers rising and falling, and the pressure of being two men who were always expected to be the loudest in the room. But the truth is, their friendship existed most comfortably in the quiet. When Rickles did eventually speak about Frank in public, it wasn't part of a planned tribute. It was during a small tribute dinner, behind closed doors, with people who had known them both. He stood up, cleared his throat, and said he had never told Frank how much he owed him. He said Frank had changed his life not with money or fame, but by letting him be exactly who he was. Then, as his voice began to break, he said something few ever heard him say. He said, "I loved him." Those who were there said you could hear the breath leave the room. Rickles ended his speech without a joke. He didn't try to soften the moment. He simply sat down, and the room stayed silent. It was the only time anyone had ever seen Don Rickles give a eulogy without laughter. And in that silence, he finally said the goodbye he couldn't bring himself to say when it mattered. In the final years of his life, Don Rickles began to open up in small ways. His voice was weaker, and his steps were slower, but the sharp mind and deep affection were still there. He was no longer performing regularly, but when he did speak, the jokes came with more reflection. The laughs were still there, but they carried a different weight. He was starting to look back more than he looked forward. It was during this time that he agreed to take part in a private gathering of close friends and family to honor Sinatra's legacy. There were no cameras, no reporters, just a room full of people who had loved Frank in ways the public would never understand. Rickles sat quietly for most of the evening, letting others share stories. When it was his turn to speak, he stood up, cleared his throat, and took a long pause. He didn't launch into a bit. He didn't roast the room. Instead, he spoke plainly, and for once, without deflection. He said Frank had saved his life, not with money, not with favors, but with friendship. He said Sinatra had believed in him before anyone else did, and that belief had given him the courage to keep going when he wasn't sure he had anything left to give. Rickles told the room that he had never really said thank you. He had made Frank laugh, yes, and he knew that counted for something. But he had never sat down, looked him in the eye, and said the words. And now, all he could do was hope that Frank had known. That somewhere, somehow, he had understood what he meant to Don. He didn't cry, but his voice wavered. People in the room did cry. One said afterward that it was the first time they had ever seen Rickles drop the mask entirely. There was no act left. Just an old man speaking about the one person who had made him feel like he truly belonged. In another quiet moment before his death, Rickles told someone that he missed the laughter most. Not the sound of the crowd, but the sound of Frank's laugh, the one that started everything. That laugh, he said, was his real legacy. Not the specials, not the television appearances, not the award shows or roasts. Just that laugh in that club all those years ago. That was the moment he became Don Rickles, and he held on to it for the rest of his life. He once said that he had lived a lucky life, and that if it all ended tomorrow, he'd go out smiling. But when asked what he would do if he had one more day, he answered without hesitation. He said he'd find Frank, sit down with him, and tell him everything he had kept inside. That he loved him, that he was grateful, that he had never once taken it for granted. But most of all, he said, he would thank him for seeing the real Don Rickles long before the rest of the world ever did. It was a rare glimpse into a man who had spent his life deflecting with humor, pushing away sentiment with punchlines. But when the act was finally over and there was nothing left to protect, Don Rickles gave the world one last truth. Frank Sinatra wasn't just a friend. He was the center of a life Rickles never thought he'd get to live. And that truth, spoken late but spoken clearly, left everyone listening in tears. Don Rickles spent a lifetime making people laugh, But the one person whose laugh meant the most to him was gone long before Don was ready to say goodbye. Behind the jokes and the late-night appearances, behind the roasts and the fast-talking stage presence, was a man who carried one quiet regret: that he never got to tell Frank Sinatra just how much he mattered. He had plenty of chances, decades of shared rooms, shared stages, and quiet moments, but the words never came. Maybe because they felt too vulnerable, or maybe because Don believed there would always be more time. In the end, there wasn't. And when he finally spoke the truth, it wasn't to an audience or a reporter. It was to a room full of friends, long after Frank was gone. What he said wasn't polished, it wasn't part of the act. It was real. He thanked Frank for seeing him when no one else did, for giving him the strength to keep going, for laughing that first night and never letting go. It took nearly a lifetime for Don Rickles to say those words. But when he finally did, they echoed louder than any punchline ever could. For more emotional stories, check out this video.